In the blistering heat of a Texas summer, the town of Redemption Creek stood as a testament to the rugged spirit of the Wild West. The air was thick with dust, and the relentless sun cast long shadows over the bustling cattle auction taking place at the town center. Jake Callahan, a seasoned rancher with weathered hands and a heart tempered by years of solitude, had come to purchase a new mare for his ranch. As Jake surveyed the crowd, his gaze was drawn to a figure that stood apart from the rest. A young Apache woman, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders, was being led to the auction block. Her eyes, though filled with sorrow, held a quiet strength that intrigued him. She was bound by ropes, her hands held tightly by the trader guiding her forward. The murmurs of the crowd faded as Jake's attention fixed solely on her. The auctioneer's voice boomed, announcing the sale of the young woman. Up for bid today, a young Apache woman, strong and healthy. A fine addition to any ranch. Starting bid is $50. The crowd shifted uneasily, some casting wary glances, others whispering among themselves. Jake felt a surge of anger rise within him. He had seen many things in his time, but the idea of a human being treated like livestock was something he couldn't abide. Without a second thought, Jake stepped forward. "I'll take her," he declared, his voice steady and firm. The crowd fell silent, eyes turning toward him in surprise. The auctioneer blinked, momentarily taken aback. "You mean, you're bidding?" Jake nodded. $50. The auctioneer hesitated, then waved his hand dismissively. "Sold," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. Jake approached the young woman, his boots kicking up the dry earth with each step. The trader handed him the rope, his expression unreadable. Jake took it, his grip firm but gentle. "You're free now," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. As they walked away from the auction, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was no mere coincidence. There was something about her, something that called to him in a way he couldn't explain. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to handle things on his own. But now, with this young woman by his side, he wondered if perhaps he had been wrong all along. The journey back to his ranch was long and silent. Jake tried to make conversation, but she remained quiet, her eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for something, or someone. He respected her silence, understanding that some wounds ran too deep to be spoken of. When they finally reached the ranch, Jake led her to the barn, offering her a place to rest. "This is your home now," he said softly. That night, as Jake sat on the porch of his modest cabin, he couldn't help but wonder about the young woman he had brought into his life. Who was she really? What had she endured to end up on that auction block? And why had he felt compelled to buy her, to bring her into his world? The answers eluded him, but one thing was certain, his life had changed forever. Under the vast Texas sky, with the stars twinkling above like distant fires, Jake Callahan realized that sometimes, fate had a way of guiding a man to where he needed to be, even if he didn't understand the path at the time. The wind had picked up by the time Jake Callahan returned to his ranch with Raven Moon. The sun, a pale orange disk on the horizon, cast long shadows over the land as if the earth itself were stretching to escape the heat. The old wagon creaked under the weight of supplies, and the sound of hooves kicking up the dry dirt filled the air. Jake hadn't said much during the ride back. The silence was comfortable enough, but it weighed on him in ways he couldn't explain. Raven Moon, the girl he'd bought for $50, sat across from him, her head bowed. She hadn't spoken a word, not even when he tried to strike up conversation on the road. Her silence wasn't the empty kind. It wasn't like the silence that filled the dusty corners of his own cabin, lonely and all-consuming. It was different, more like the stillness before a storm, full of something unspoken and waiting to explode. He couldn't figure her out. Every time he looked at her, he saw something more. She was like a wild horse, untamed, stubborn, full of energy yet calm, like she was holding something back. It was the first time Jake felt like someone had entered his life that wasn't just passing through. By the time they reached the Double H Ranch, the sun had slipped below the horizon. The land was quiet, as it always was when the day's work was done. Jake didn't say much as he led the horses into the corral and began unloading the wagon. "Welcome home," Jake said, mostly to himself. He didn't expect her to respond. Raven Moon didn't say anything as she climbed down from the wagon, but the look she gave him, something sharp and searching, left him uneasy. The ranch was just as Jake had left it, rustic, barren, and quiet. His home, such as it was, consisted of a small cabin with a front porch that overlooked the valley. The barn was off to the side, surrounded by wooden fences and a patch of dry land that could barely keep a cow fed. There was no wife, no children, no family. Just the land, the horses, and the cattle. "I've got work to do," Jake muttered, though Raven Moon was already walking toward the barn without a word. She didn't need instructions. There was something in the way she moved, graceful and precise, like she knew what she was doing. Jake followed her after a moment, but his thoughts were miles away. He wasn't sure why he'd bought her. There were plenty of workers he could hire, he didn't need some girl who couldn't even speak. Yet, as the days wore on, Raven Moon proved herself in ways he hadn't expected. The first day, she handled the horses like she'd been born in a saddle. She knew how to calm the restless ones, the ones that bucked and kicked, and there was a quiet strength in the way she worked with them. It was a gift, that much was clear. She could make them listen to her. Hell, even Jake had trouble with his own horses sometimes. By the second day, Raven Moon was mending fences, and by the third, she was taking care of the chickens, feeding the cattle, and even working on the barn. She was efficient, strong, and without question, a natural. Jake couldn't deny it anymore, she was more than just a survivor. And yet, as she worked alongside him, her silence still lingered, heavy and unspoken. Jake found himself watching her more than he intended, noticing the way she held herself, like she was carrying some unseen weight, something heavier than the days of labor that passed between them. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day, Jake finally broke the silence. "I don't know why I brought you here," he said, staring into the flames. "I wasn't looking for company." Raven Moon's eyes flicked toward him, her gaze sharp but not hostile. She said nothing, but the quiet tension in the air seemed to ease for a moment. Jake couldn't explain why, but it felt like she understood. She didn't need words to make it clear. "Maybe you weren't the only one," he muttered, and to his surprise, Raven Moon gave a slight nod, her eyes drifting back to the fire. It was the first sign of understanding between them, and in that moment, Jake realized something. They weren't so different, after all. They were both two souls lost in the vast expanse of the Badlands, both searching for something they couldn't name. And maybe, just maybe, they'd found it in each other. But that didn't make the silence any easier to bear. Jake Callahan had been alone for as long as he could remember. The ranch was his life, the land his constant companion. He didn't have much else, just his work, the horses, and the vast stretch of earth he called home. But that was all right by him. He didn't need anyone else, not after the years he'd spent fighting through the hell of war, the pain of loss, and the solitude of a man who had no place in the world except where he stood. But now, with Raven Moon on his ranch, things felt different. He didn't quite know what to make of it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was changing, and it wasn't just because of the ranch chores she'd taken on without a word. No, it was something more. There was an unsettling quiet that had settled between them, a silence that held more weight than any words ever could. Raven had been there for 3 weeks now, and still, she didn't say a word. Not one. Not that Jake expected her to. He hadn't bought her to fill the empty space in his cabin with chatter, but there was something in the way she moved that made him uneasy. It was as if she was always watching, waiting, and yet she never gave anything away. Every morning, Jake would wake to find her already up and working, tending to the horses or the cattle, moving as though she belonged there. It was almost eerie, the way she moved so seamlessly through the work of the ranch. She was strong, no doubt about it, stronger than any of the ranch hands Jake had hired in the past. The animals responded to her as if she had some kind of natural gift with them. They followed her lead, trusted her, and that was something Jake couldn't ignore. But it wasn't just the animals that seemed to trust her. There was something in the way the land responded to her as well. Every evening, after a long day of work, Jake would watch her stand at the edge of the property, looking out over the hills, her hair blowing in the wind, her posture perfect and unmoving. Sometimes, he would catch her humming, a low, soft sound that seemed to echo in the silence of the evening. She was becoming a part of the ranch in ways Jake never expected. It wasn't just the work, it was something deeper, something intangible. He could feel it in the way the earth seemed to soften beneath her boots, in the way the horses followed her gaze, and in the way his heart seemed to beat a little faster every time she walked past him. But even as Raven became more connected to the ranch, trouble began to brew. Word of her strange abilities had spread throughout Redemption Creek, and not everyone was pleased about it. Rumors swirled that she was a witch, that her powers came from dark forces. At first, Jake dismissed them as idle gossip. But then he saw the way the townsfolk began to look at her when they visited the ranch. Fearful eyes. Whispers behind closed doors. It wasn't long before the tension reached its breaking point. Jake was working on the northern boundary fence when he saw Burke Foster ride up with a group of men. They were all armed, their faces hard and set like stone. Burke, a scoundrel Jake had known for years, dismounted and strode toward him. "You've got that Apache girl working for you now, Callahan." Burke's voice was low, full of contempt. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes narrowing. "What's it to you, Foster?" Burke smirked, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "Nothing at all. Just thought you'd want to know that folks in town are getting mighty nervous about her. People are talkin', Callahan. Talkin' about witchcraft, about the devil's work." Jake's jaw tightened. He had expected this, but hearing it out loud still sent a chill down his spine. He didn't care what people said, but if Raven was in danger, that was a different matter. "She's no witch," Jake said, his voice steady. "She's just a woman trying to survive. She works harder than any man I know." Burke's eyes gleamed with malice. "Doesn't matter what you think, Jake. You can't protect her forever. People are talking, and there's only so long you can keep the peace before they come for her." The warning in Burke's voice was clear, and Jake didn't miss it. Raven was more than just a guest on his ranch now. She was becoming a symbol, one that the people of Redemption Creek didn't know how to handle. Jake's protective instincts kicked in, but he knew that protecting Raven wouldn't be as simple as telling off a few troublemakers. This was bigger than that. Burke and the others would not be swayed by simple words. And if they were after Raven, it wouldn't be long before they came for him too. As Burke and his men left, Jake stood there, staring at the horizon. The ranch was his home, but it seemed the world outside was closing in, threatening to tear it all apart. Raven wasn't just a part of the land anymore, she had become something much bigger, and whether Jake liked it or not, that meant trouble was on its way. The air was thick with tension, the kind of oppressive weight that sat heavy in a man's chest and made it hard to breathe. Jake Callahan had seen trouble before, but this time, it wasn't the kind that could be solved with a rifle or a well-timed fist. This was different. The rumors about Raven Moon had spread like wildfire, and it wasn't long before the whole town of Redemption Creek had taken notice. The whispers had turned into open accusations, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the storm would hit. That day came sooner than he expected. Jake was out by the barn, working on the fence when he saw them, a group of men riding up on horseback, their faces set in grim expressions. At the front of the pack was Marshal Briggs, the lawman of Redemption Creek. The marshal had always been a man of few words, but Jake knew the kind of man he was. Briggs wasn't the kind to stir up trouble, but when the town turned against someone, even a lawman like him had to play along. Jake wiped his hands on his pants and stood tall, watching as they approached. The horses' hooves kicked up the dust as they drew closer, their riders holding the reins tight. "Jake Callahan," Briggs called out, his voice carrying over the wind. "We need to have a word with you." Jake didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed his arms and leaned against the wooden fence. "What about?" "We're here about the Apache girl you've got working for you," Briggs said, his eyes hardening. "The town's talkin', and the talk ain't good." Jake's stomach tightened. "Raven's no trouble," he said, his voice low but firm. "She's just a girl looking for a place to work. Ain't nothing wrong with that." Briggs' gaze flickered toward the other men behind him. Some of them were familiar faces, men who had worked alongside Jake in the past. But now, they all looked at him with suspicion in their eyes. "She's not just a girl, Jake," Briggs said, stepping forward. "People in this town are worried about her. They're calling her a witch, a bringer of bad luck. You know how people are when they're scared." Jake's fists clenched at his sides. "I don't care about rumors. Raven ain't no witch." Briggs shook his head. "You don't understand, Jake. There's a whole town turning against her. And that means trouble for you, too." Jake's thoughts raced, but he held his ground. "I'm not running from this," he said, his voice steady. "If they've got a problem with Raven, they can take it up with me. She ain't going anywhere." The tension in the air thickened, and Jake knew this wasn't just about Raven anymore. It was about him, about his place in the town, and about the growing fear that had taken hold of everyone. The rumors had spread like wildfire, and now it was time for someone to take the blame. If Raven was the target, then Jake was standing beside her, and that meant the townsfolk had to go through him first. "You might be right, Jake," Briggs said, his voice softening for a moment. "But I can't stop what's coming. They're already talking about putting her on trial. The preacher's even said he'll do it." Jake's heart sank. Pastor Gage, always a man of strong beliefs, was now preaching against Raven. The words hit harder than he expected. The preacher was respected in the town, and if he spoke out, it could turn the tide against Raven, and fast. "Trial for what?" Jake demanded, his voice rising. "What's she done wrong?" "They say she's cursed the land, brought bad luck to the cattle," Briggs replied. "Folks are scared, Jake. They're looking for someone to blame." Jake stood tall, his jaw clenched tight. "I won't let them do this to her." "You're not in charge here, Jake," Briggs said, his tone firm. "This town's scared, and when people get scared, they do things they regret." "I don't give a damn about their fear," Jake snapped. "I'm not letting anyone take her." Briggs hesitated, then spoke in a lower voice. "I'm just telling you, Jake, it's going to get ugly. If you don't step aside, you might find yourself on trial too." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. There was no turning back now. The storm was here, and it wasn't just about Raven anymore. It was about his own fight to protect the life he'd built in this unforgiving land. "I'm not backing down, Briggs," Jake said, his voice calm but filled with steel. "You can tell them I'll fight to the end." Briggs nodded, but the look in his eyes told Jake all he needed to know. The fight was just beginning. As the men rode off, Jake stood in the yard, watching them disappear into the distance. His mind raced with thoughts of Raven, of the trial they would face, of the town that would turn against them. But one thing was certain, Jake Callahan wasn't about to let anyone tear apart the life he had with Raven Moon. Not without one hell of a fight. The wind howled through the canyon, whipping at the edges of the Double H Ranch like a beast determined to claw its way inside. The heat of the day had settled into the cool of the evening, and Jake Callahan stood at the edge of the porch, his hand resting on the rough wooden railing. His gaze lingered on the horizon, where the faint glow of the setting sun painted the sky in a streak of crimson and orange. It was a sight that should have brought him peace, but tonight, there was no peace to be found. He had been thinking all day, thinking about Raven, about the rumors that had begun to spread, and about what was coming. The trial. The fear. The accusations. And, more than anything, the sense that the quiet life he'd worked so hard to build was slipping through his fingers like sand. "Jake," came a voice from behind him, soft but steady. He turned, and there she was, Raven Moon. Her presence, as always, was quiet but undeniable. Her dark eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, the world seemed to still around them. There were no words exchanged. There never needed to be. It was in the way she held herself, in the way she walked toward him, her movements as fluid and graceful as the wind itself. She had been silent for so long, and Jake had begun to wonder if she would ever speak. But there were times when silence spoke louder than words ever could. And tonight, the silence between them felt like a promise. A promise that, despite everything that was happening, they would face it together. "You feel it, too, don't you?" Jake asked, his voice low, almost like he was speaking to himself. "The storm comin'?" Raven didn't answer. She simply stepped closer to him, her hand brushing against his, and the touch was enough to tell him everything he needed to know. She wasn't afraid. Not the way the townsfolk were. She was something else, something beyond the fear and suspicion that clouded the air in Redemption Creek. Her presence, though silent, was a force of nature. And Jake had no doubt she could handle whatever was coming. They stood there for a while, side by side, watching the sky darken. Then, without a word, Raven moved toward the barn. Jake followed her, curiosity gnawing at his insides. There was something about tonight that felt different, something about Raven's stillness that told him she was preparing for something, though she didn't say a word. The barn door creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the animals shifted restlessly, sensing the change in the air, but Raven moved with a calm that settled them. She walked toward the far side, where a small, weathered table stood with bottles and herbs laid out in neat rows. Jake stopped just inside the doorway, his boots scraping against the dirt floor. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rough. Raven didn't answer right away. Instead, she gathered a few herbs from the table, her hands moving deftly as she crushed them between her fingers. The faint scent of sage and lavender filled the air. It was a smell Jake had come to associate with her in the past few weeks, calming, soothing, almost otherworldly. Raven turned then, holding the mixture in her hands, and looked at Jake. For the first time since she'd arrived, she spoke. "I can heal them," she said softly. Her voice was like a breeze, low and melodic, but there was a depth to it that made Jake's heart tighten. "The animals. The land. They listen to me." Jake's breath caught in his chest. "You're saying you can heal him? Just like that?" She nodded, a slight movement of her head. "It's not just about the animals. It's about the land. The people." Jake didn't know what to make of it, but there was something in her voice, something in the way she stood there, that told him she wasn't lying. The stillness in the air seemed to shift, like the earth itself was waiting for her next move. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Jake asked, his voice hoarse with the weight of everything unsaid between them. Raven's eyes softened, and she stepped closer to him, her gaze never leaving his. "I didn't know if you'd believe me," she said. "But I know what's coming. The people of the town, they're scared. And when people are scared, they turn on what they don't understand. I can help them, Jake. I can help all of you." Jake's mind raced as he processed her words. He had always believed in hard work, in doing what needed to be done with his own two hands. But Raven was different. She had a gift, a power that, until now, he hadn't fully understood. "You'll be the one they come for, won't you?" Jake said quietly, his words barely more than a whisper. Raven met his gaze, her eyes full of something deep, something ancient. "I'll be ready," she replied. "And I won't be alone." As the evening wore on, Jake found himself once again standing at the edge of the ranch, looking out at the horizon. The winds had picked up, stirring the dry dust in small whirlwinds that twisted and turned like ghosts in the night. And though trouble was coming, Jake knew one thing for certain: Raven Moon wasn't the cause of it. She was the key to surviving it. The days leading up to the trial felt like a storm on the horizon, distant at first, but getting closer with every passing moment. The heat of the summer had faded, leaving the ranch in an eerie stillness, as though the land itself was holding its breath. The quiet was unnerving, the calm before something far worse than a thunderstorm. Jake Callahan found himself out by the northern fence again, mending the posts that the wind had knocked loose. His hands worked mechanically, the repetitive motion of driving the nails into the wooden beams giving his mind little room to wander. But even as he hammered the last post in place, his thoughts kept drifting back to Raven Moon, to the fear that had taken hold of Redemption Creek, and to the coming trial that loomed over them like a dark cloud. He had been fighting battles all his life, first in the war, then in the unforgiving land of Texas, but nothing had prepared him for this. This fight wasn't with men who could be fought with a rifle. It wasn't even about cattle or crops or the ranch itself. This was about something deeper, something that spoke to the very soul of the land. This was about Raven. The townsfolk were scared, and when people were scared, they did things they'd regret. Jake had always known that. He had seen it during the war, when fear made men turn on their own brothers. And now, fear was doing the same thing to the people of Redemption Creek. They didn't understand Raven, and so they turned on her, calling her a witch, a devil's messenger. And Jake had to watch as the people he had known all his life began to look at him like he was the one who had brought the curse upon them. That evening, Jake sat alone at the table in his cabin, a half-empty glass of whiskey sitting untouched in front of him. The shadows of the fire flickered across the walls, and the sound of the wind howling outside made the cabin feel colder than it was. He stared at the bottle for a long moment, the warmth of it tempting, but he pushed the thought away. This wasn't the time for drinking. This was the time for making a choice. The decision had already been made. He had stood by Raven when he brought her to the ranch, and he would stand by her now, even if it meant losing everything he had worked for. The ranch. The land. His place in the town. He had made his choice, and there was no going back now. Raven had become more than just a part of the ranch, she had become a part of him. In the silence of the nights, when they sat together by the fire, there was a bond that passed between them without the need for words. She had never said much, but Jake knew what she meant every time she looked at him, every time she touched his arm as they worked together. It was a connection deeper than any conversation could ever be. The next morning, Jake found himself outside again, his mind restless as he worked. Raven had gone off early, as usual, to tend to the horses. She had a way with them, a way that made them trust her without question. Even the most stubborn of horses would calm at her touch. Jake had seen it with his own eyes. But today was different. As Jake looked across the field, he saw Raven standing by the creek, her back to him. She was motionless, her eyes focused on something in the distance. Something in the way she stood, so still and silent, made Jake's heart skip a beat. She was no longer just the Apache girl he had brought into his life. She was something more, something that felt as old as the land itself, as untamed and powerful as the Texas Badlands. Raven turned slowly, her dark eyes locking with his. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. There was no ranch, no trial, no fear. There was only the two of them, standing there in the morning light, and Jake realized something he had known all along. No matter what happened, he couldn't lose her. Not now. Not ever. You know what's coming, don't you? Jake asked, his voice low and steady. Raven nodded, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say anything. Jake could see it in her eyes, the acceptance of what was to come. The town wouldn't stop until they had their pound of flesh, until they had made an example out of her. But Raven wasn't afraid. Not like the others. She had faced worse in her life than any trial the town could throw at her. Jake walked over to her, the weight of the world heavy on his shoulders. "I won't let them take you," he said, his voice fierce, filled with the kind of determination he had only felt in the darkest of times. Raven reached out, her hand brushing his arm gently. She didn't need to speak. She didn't need to reassure him. The bond between them was unspoken, yet understood. And as the day wore on, Jake knew that the trial would come, the judgment would be passed, and the town would make its decision. But Raven Moon wasn't just another soul to be judged. She was his, and he would protect her, no matter the cost. The wind had a way of carrying secrets across the land in the Texas Badlands, and Jake Callahan had a feeling that the storm was coming. It wasn't just the weather, it was something deeper. Something that had been building for weeks, ever since Raven Moon had stepped foot on his ranch. The whispers of the town had turned to threats, and now, it seemed like the town was ready to turn on them both. Jake had always lived alone. The land, the cattle, the horses, these were his companions. He never asked for much, and he never got too close to anyone. But Raven had changed everything. She had entered his life like a wildfire, wild and untamed, and now, the fire was spreading, threatening to consume everything in its path. The news of the trial spread quickly, and Jake could feel the weight of it every time he stepped into Redemption Creek. The faces he had known for years now looked at him with suspicion, their eyes filled with fear and doubt. It was as if the town had forgotten who he was, forgotten the man who had worked alongside them in the fields, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with them through thick and thin. Now, all they saw was a man who had taken in a girl they didn't understand. Jake couldn't let it happen. He couldn't let them take Raven. She had become more than just a worker on his ranch. She had become a part of him. And he wasn't going to let fear tear that apart. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, Jake stood at the edge of the ranch, looking out over the land. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, the kind of sunset that reminded him why he loved this place. It was his home, his sanctuary, and he had no intention of letting anyone take it from him. Raven stood beside him, her presence as quiet as the night that was falling around them. She hadn't said much in the past few days, but Jake could feel the weight of her thoughts, the same way he could feel the weight of his own. They were both caught in the same storm, and neither of them knew what would happen next. "What are we gonna do?" Jake finally asked, his voice low, carrying the weight of the question. Raven turned her head to look at him, her eyes dark and full of something Jake couldn't name. She had always been a mystery to him, but tonight, she seemed even more so. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, it was as if she knew something that Jake didn't, something he couldn't see. "I'll face it," she said softly, her voice steady, though there was a tension in it that Jake couldn't ignore. "I've faced worse before." Jake shook his head, the thought of losing her too much to bear. "You shouldn't have to face anything. Not here. Not with me." But Raven just looked at him, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You've been fighting for years, Jake. This is my fight too." Jake didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't just about Raven anymore. It was about the town, about the people he had known all his life, and about the way things had changed in such a short time. He had spent years building this life, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "People are scared," Raven continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When people are scared, they'll do anything. But fear doesn't have to control us. It doesn't have to control you." Jake looked at her, his heart swelling with something he couldn't explain. She was right. Fear had taken hold of the town, and now it was up to him to decide how to fight back. But how? How could he stand against the whole town? "You're right," Jake said, his voice firm now. "I won't let fear control me. Not now, not ever." Raven smiled then, a small, quiet smile that made Jake's chest tighten. It was a smile that said everything. She didn't need him to protect her. She didn't need him to fight her battles. But he would fight by her side, no matter what. That night, as Jake lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, he made a promise to himself. He would stand with Raven, no matter the cost. If the town wanted a fight, they would get one. And he would make sure they knew that some things, like love, loyalty, and the land, were worth fighting for. The next morning, Jake woke to find Raven already up, already working. The quiet determination in her movements reminded him of the fire that burned in her, a fire that he had come to depend on. And as they worked together that day, Jake knew that no matter what happened, they would face it together. The storm wasn't over yet. But Jake Callahan was ready to face it head-on. Jake Callahan had never been one to back down from a fight. In his younger days, he had fought in battles that had taken him to hell and back, and he had come out the other side with scars to prove it. But this fight, the one that was brewing over Raven Moon, was unlike anything he had faced before. This wasn't about defending his ranch, his cattle, or even his land. This was about something deeper, something that had settled in his heart ever since Raven had stepped onto his property. The trial was the talk of the town, and every day, the whispers grew louder. People who had once called Jake a friend were now looking at him with suspicion, their eyes filled with fear and doubt. It was as if the town had forgotten who he was, forgotten the man who had worked alongside them in the fields, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with them through thick and thin. Now, all they saw was a man who had taken in a girl they didn't understand. Jake couldn't let it happen. He couldn't let them take Raven. She had become more than just a worker on his ranch. She had become a part of him. And he wasn't about to let fear tear that apart. That evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, Jake stood at the edge of the ranch, looking out over the land. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple, the kind of sunset that reminded him why he loved this place. It was his home, his sanctuary, and he had no intention of letting anyone take it from him. Raven stood beside him, her presence as quiet as the night that was falling around them. She hadn't said much in the past few days, but Jake could feel the weight of her thoughts, the same way he could feel the weight of his own. They were both caught in the same storm, and neither of them knew what would happen next. "What are we gonna do?" Jake finally asked, his voice low, carrying the weight of the question. Raven turned her head to look at him, her eyes dark and full of something Jake couldn't name. She had always been a mystery to him, but tonight, she seemed even more so. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, it was as if she knew something that Jake didn't, something he couldn't see. "I'll face it," she said softly, her voice steady, though there was a tension in it that Jake couldn't ignore. "I've faced worse before." Jake shook his head, the thought of losing her too much to bear. "You shouldn't have to face anything. Not here. Not with me." But Raven just looked at him, her gaze steady and unflinching. "You've been fighting for years, Jake. This is my fight too." Jake didn't know what to say to that. It wasn't just about Raven anymore. It was about the town, about the people he had known all his life, and about the way things had changed in such a short time. He had spent years building this life, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "People are scared," Raven continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "When people are scared, they'll do anything. But fear doesn't have to control us. It doesn't have to control you." Jake looked at her, his heart swelling with something he couldn't explain. She was right. Fear had taken hold of the town, and now it was up to him to decide how to fight back. But how? How could he stand against the whole town? "You're right," Jake said, his voice firm now. "I won't let fear control me. Not now, not ever." Raven smiled then, a small, quiet smile that made Jake's chest tighten. It was a smile that said everything. She didn't need him to protect her. She didn't need him to fight her battles. But he would fight by her side, no matter what. That night, as Jake lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling, he made a promise to himself. He would stand with Raven, no matter the cost. If the town wanted a fight, they would get one. And he would make sure they knew that some things, like love, loyalty, and the land, were worth fighting for. The next morning, Jake woke to find Raven already up, already working. The quiet determination in her movements reminded him of the fire that burned in her, a fire that he had come to depend on. And as they worked together that day, Jake knew that no matter what happened, they would face it together. The storm wasn't over yet. But Jake Callahan was ready to face it head-on. The day of the trial had finally come, and Redemption Creek was thick with tension. The town that had once felt like a home to Jake Callahan now felt foreign, as if the people he had known for years had turned their backs on him. Every step he took down the dirt road toward the makeshift courthouse seemed heavier than the last. The sun hung high in the sky, its heat bearing down on the town, and the air felt thick with dust and fear. Jake's boots kicked up the dirt as he walked, his mind racing. He had spent every waking moment since the mob had come to his ranch preparing for this. He had done everything in his power to protect Raven Moon, to shield her from the fear and the hate that had consumed the town. But deep down, Jake knew that today wasn't just about Raven. It was about him, too. It was about the town deciding whether they would tear apart the life he had built or whether they would stand with him and Raven, no matter what. As he approached the courthouse, Jake could hear the murmurs of the crowd. The people of Redemption Creek had gathered, eager for what was to come. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of duty, but Jake could see the fear in their eyes. They weren't just scared of Raven, they were scared of change. Scared of the unknown. Raven stood at his side, her presence quiet and unwavering. She had not spoken a word that morning, but Jake could feel the strength radiating from her. She didn't need to say anything. She knew what was at stake. She knew the weight of this moment. Inside the courthouse, the judge's gavel rang out, calling the proceedings to order. Judge Reed, formerly Judge Abraham Lincoln, a man Jake had known for years, sat behind the worn wooden desk, his eyes scanning the room. His face was impassive, but Jake could see the tension in the set of his jaw. Jake Callahan, the judge called, his voice steady. You are here today to answer for harboring this Apache girl, Raven Moon, and for the charges of witchcraft and treason brought against her. How do you plead? Jake stood tall, his gaze unwavering. He knew this wasn't just about pleading innocent or guilty. This was about standing his ground, about showing the town that he wouldn't let them destroy what he had built. I plead not guilty, Your Honor, Jake said, his voice firm, loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. The crowd shifted, whispers spreading like wildfire. Raven stood beside him, her eyes locked onto the judge. She wasn't afraid. Not now. Not ever. Very well, Judge Reed said, his gavel falling again. We shall proceed with the trial. The trial was a farce from the beginning. The prosecutor, Pastor Gage, formerly Reverend Holt, led the charge, accusing Raven of being a witch, of bringing curses upon the town. He called witnesses who spoke of the strange things they had seen, the way the animals responded to her, the way she had healed the sick. But none of them could explain it, and none of them could prove it. They were all just frightened whispers. Jake didn't speak much during the trial. He didn't need to. He knew the town's mind was already made up. But when it was his turn to stand, he stepped forward and looked at the jury, at the men and women who had once called him a friend. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of everything he had worked for. Raven Moon is not what you think she is, Jake said. She's not a witch, and she's not some curse. She's a woman, just like any of you. She's had a hard life, a life that none of you could ever understand. But I'll tell you this, she's done more for this land, for these animals, than any of you ever have. And I won't let you tear her down just because you're scared. The room fell silent. The judge's gavel rang out again, and Jake stepped back, his chest heavy with the weight of his words. He didn't know what the outcome would be. He didn't know if the town would see reason or if they would continue to be driven by fear. But what Jake did know was that Raven wasn't alone anymore. She had a place here, on this land, with him. And no matter what happened, they would face it together. As the trial continued, Jake couldn't help but feel a shift in the air. The tension was still there, but there was something else too, something new, something that hadn't been there before. It was as if the town was beginning to see Raven for who she truly was, not as a curse, but as a woman of strength and grace. And that gave Jake a glimmer of hope. The storm was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Jake felt like they might just make it through the night. The sun had long since dipped behind the hills, casting a faint twilight over Redemption Creek. The air had settled into that stillness that comes only after a storm has passed, but Jake Callahan knew that, for him, the real storm had just begun. As he sat alone on the porch of his cabin, the sounds of the night settling around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. The trial was over. The verdict had been handed down. And while Raven had been acquitted, the shadows of fear still loomed over the town. Redemption Creek hadn't fully accepted her, hadn't fully embraced what she was and what she could do. But they couldn't take her from him anymore. Jake felt a weight in his chest, a mixture of relief and uncertainty. He had stood his ground. He had protected Raven, and in doing so, he had defended something far more important, the life he had built, the land that had been passed down to him, and the love that had unexpectedly grown between him and a woman from a world he had never fully understood. Raven stood at the edge of the porch, her silhouette outlined against the fading light of the horizon. She hadn't spoken much since the trial, but Jake could see it in her posture. She was tired, but there was something else too. There was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself now, a strength that wasn't just born of the land, but of the fight they had both endured. "You did it," Jake said softly, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had been through. Raven turned slowly to face him, a quiet smile on her lips. "We did it," she corrected him. Jake nodded, standing to join her at the edge of the porch. The wind had picked up again, and the dry earth beneath them seemed to hum with life, as if the land itself was breathing a sigh of relief. "I never thought it would come to this," he said, looking out over the ranch, the vast emptiness stretching as far as the eye could see. "I never thought I'd be fightin' for this place, for us. But here we are." Raven didn't answer right away, but there was a depth in her eyes, a recognition of the unspoken bond that had formed between them. "I've always been on my own," Jake continued, his voice rough, as if the words had been buried deep for too long. "The land, the cattle, they've always been enough for me. But then you came along, and everything changed. I didn't know what to do with that." Raven stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture so simple, yet so powerful. "Sometimes," she said, her voice soft but filled with truth, "the land isn't all a man needs. Sometimes, it's the people he shares it with." Jake looked down at her, and for the first time in a long time, he saw not just a woman he had fought to protect, but someone who had become as much a part of him as the ranch itself. He hadn't just saved her, she had saved him too, in ways he couldn't explain. The silence stretched between them, comfortable and full of understanding. As the night grew darker, Jake realized something. The storm had passed, but the fight was far from over. Redemption Creek wouldn't change overnight. There would always be those who feared what they didn't understand. But Raven didn't need their approval. And neither did he. Together, they had faced the fear, the judgment, and the whispers of a town too scared to see the truth. And they had come out on the other side stronger. "Where do we go from here?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with both hope and uncertainty. Raven looked up at the stars, her eyes distant for a moment. "Wherever the land takes us," she said, a quiet confidence in her voice. "Wherever we want to go." And as Jake looked at her, standing beside him, strong and unyielding, he knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. As the stars began to twinkle above them, Jake Callahan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The fight was over for now, but their journey had only just begun. What would the future hold for them? Would the town ever fully accept Raven? Would they continue to fight, side by side, no matter the odds? Only time would tell. But Jake knew one thing for certain, he wasn't facing it alone anymore.